Good morning, class. Today we are going to be learning more about time. So I'm going to start out with a question. When someone asks you to write down a time for something, how do you write it down? Would you draw a picture of a clock and say, oh, it's this time? That wouldn't make much sense, and that would kind of take a long time, right? You wouldn't draw a picture of a clock to let them know what time it was. You would write it down in digital form. Okay, so if I said, your appointment is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, please write that down. You would write it down so it would look like it would on a digital clock. So if it's 3 o'clock, you'd write the hour first, and then you'd write 00 for o'clock. Okay? So let's practice doing that. So if I said, can you write down the time 4 o'clock? You'd write down your hour first, which is 4, and then your 2 dots, and then o'clock. So if I said write down 1 o'clock, I start with my hour, 1, my 2 dots, and then o'clock. So 4 o'clock, 1 o'clock. Okay? You can also write it out in words, and that might look like this. 4 o'clock. But we don't see that one very often. So we're just going to stick to the digital way to write things down. So let's practice this. I'm going to erase my board, and we are going to look at the analog clock, and then we're going to write it down in digital form. Okay? So let's grab my analog clock here. We're going to change the time a little bit. All right, here we go. So here's our analog clock. Remember from Mrs. Stokes' other learning video that we first look at the little hand that tells us the hour. So it's 3. The minute hand is straight up at the 12, so it's o'clock. 3 o'clock. So the way that we'd write that down on digital, and you might already be writing this down or thinking what it would look like, but we'd start with our hour first. So 3, our 2 dots, then o'clock. If you wrote down 3 o'clock, you did it right. Nice work. Okay, let's try it again. So we're going to change our time. Oh, here we go. So remember, we start with the hour hand first. It's pointing at the 6. So it's 6 o'clock. So we'd write 6 o'clock like this in digital. We'd start with an hour. We do our 2 dots, and we'd say o'clock. 6 o'clock. Okay? So let's practice. This time I'm just going to tell you a time, and I want you to write down the time that I say, and we are going to check to see if it's right. Please write down the time 11 o'clock. Just drop my marker. 11 o'clock. If you wrote down this, 11 o'clock, you are correct. Nice work. Let's do 2 more. Please write down the time 5 o'clock. If you wrote down 5 o'clock, you are correct. Nice work. Now I want you to write down the time 8 o'clock. Let's check and see. If you wrote down 8 and then 2 dots or semicolon and then o'clock, you did it right. 8 o'clock. So let's practice reading the times. 11 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock. Nice work.